Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro FM, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and we have today regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of three representatives to the town of Brattleboro, as well as Matt Dunne, who is the founder and executive director of the Center on Rural Innovation, located, I believe, in White River Junction. Is that correct, Matt?
Heartland Three Corners, actually.
Heartland Three Corners. So glad to have you today. And one of the things we're going to talk about with Matt is some of his organization's findings around rural employment in the wake of COVID. But one thing I want to talk to you quickly about, Matt, is what is the Center on Rural Innovation and why does Vermont need something like that?
Sure. So the Center on Rural Innovation was created in 2017 to address the rural opportunity gap. We have, over the years, urban and rural places have traditionally actually tracked each other economically. Sometimes one will do a little better, sometimes one will do a little worse, but they've basically tracked over time. That all changed in 2008. And with the Great Recession, rural and urban places just diverged in their economic trajectory. Urban places came roaring back to their pre-recession levels, and rural places did not. And there was a few drivers to that. The automation of traditional rural jobs. The second was globalization through both policy and technology that allowed for larger companies to look for lower cost labor, not just in lower cost rural America, but lower cost places across the globe. And the third was the decline in entrepreneurship, which had been falling for the 30 years prior to 2008. And what that meant was that when the economic shock of 2008 happened, the outsourcing to other parts of the world accelerated, automation accelerated, but there also wasn't the farm team of companies to come in behind the ones that would naturally, go away when there is a recession. And so coming out of the 2008, there were definitely winners and losers in the economy. The winners were largely focused on digital economy jobs, the benefit of automation, which was almost exclusively in urban places, and rural places took the hit. And pre-COVID in 2020, you saw 5% of all technology jobs being based in rural places, even though rural America represents conservatively 15% of the nation's workforce. So that gap alone accounted for this huge differential in wages, in employment, and other things like the demographics in various parts of the country. So we started the Center on Rural Innovation to hit those issues head on, to be able to make sure that we could build digital economy ecosystems in rural places. We started with a pilot in Springfield, Vermont, which had been, the machine tool and innovation capital of the country. For 40 years, it had the highest per capita income in the state of Vermont until it didn't. And it definitely took the hit of machine tool finally, for all intensive purposes, leaving for good around 2000. But they also had built gigabit speed internet, fastest broadband speeds in the world to the home. They just hadn't figured out how to leverage that for economic renewal. So we started with that work in Springfield. We were then able to receive funding to start bringing that work to other parts of the country of building digital economy jobs, as well as scalable tech companies that were locally grown, and be able to create a network. Because we also believe that in this early stage of transitioning rural economies, we're going to have a collaborative, right? Because there isn't quite the deal flow or the talent flow in any individual rural community. But if you create a collaborative, like we're doing, you get network value. And so that's part of our whole effort. So we're headquartered in Heartland Three Corners, but we're working with communities across 18 states and just finding unbelievable leaders, people like Bob Flint, who we were talking about before the program, who are committed to their community's economic future, but also understanding that they have to change and embrace jobs for the future.
I'd love to just drill a little bit down into something before we move into the study.
Okay.
When you mentioned the decline in entrepreneurship, I think when people first hear that off the cuff, it sounds as if like people just weren't being as creative as they used to be. And so I want to name that entrepreneurship is not just this magical spirit that we talk about in politics, but in fact is an ecosystem that was dampened by troubles with access to finance, with deep consolidations in markets and opportunity. And so it's, when I think about the network that you're hoping to create, it's really creating an ecosystem for that rather than just people's magical creativity. Because lots of people are creative, but only some people have access to capital.
Right. And in order to have a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem, you've got to be intentional about it, right? You've got to your point, it has to be, understanding how that can work. In some ways, having people who give permission for folks to take a risk, and then to make sure that there is true access to capital that is democratized.
Thank you.
So let's dive into the report that the Center on Rural Innovation did around employment impacts and COVID. One thing I found interesting is that it seems in both, now actually I wanted to clarify this. You talk about non-metro and metro areas. Are they all in rural communities? Like, or are you talking New York City versus Brattleboro?
So, one of the challenges with being an organization that's committed to rural is the wide-ranging definitions of what is rural. And it's always funny to me when I have people on the one hand saying, "What, you're doing work in Springfield, Vermont? That's not rural."
Yeah.
And then other people to me say, "Oh, you're doing rural, so you mean like St. Louis?" And I'm like, no, not that. That is not what we're doing. So there is, and then the federal government actually doesn't help, which is usually the arbiter for how you define different things along geographic and demographic trends. And we have counted no fewer than 20 different definitions of rural, some of them in conflict with one another. So,
and I think especially in Vermont, and I imagine this might be true in other rural states, the rural is very much a felt experience rather than a demographic experience. And so I'm a member of the Rural Economic Development Caucus in the State House, and I get teased a little bit like, "Oh, you're from Brattleboro, you shouldn't be here." And I'm like, well, I live on a dirt road with no cell phone service. And so I think I should be here because those are the problems of rural economic development. Similarly, when we talk about small businesses and micro businesses in Vermont, when we talk about small businesses, people are thinking of, 5 to 10 employees, when in fact, small businesses in America, we're talking about, less than 450 employees sometimes.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I appreciate that we're spending this time in definition land.
Yeah. So we actually think that the Center on Medicaid and Medicare actually does the best job of differentiating between urban and rural. We haven't figured out why they got that granular, but they seem to do it right, and it passes at least a straight face test. But in broad strokes, we're looking at communities between 5,000 and 45,000 in size for our work, not for the impact. I mean, obviously we're headquartered in a community of 3,500 people. But the places where we're doing this work of building digital economy ecosystems, that's the range, and they're not suburbs. And it's usually pretty easy to figure out which are suburbs and which are not in terms of proximity to very large metros and where employment flows go. So metro and non-metro is one of the definitions that's out there. It's not a bad one. It's sometimes, aggregated by county, which becomes problematic, as you can probably imagine. It's a very different thing to be in Baltimore, Vermont, than White River Junction, Vermont, but it is still a good delineation across the national landscape. So that's the one that we used, and it's the way that this data has been broken down.
Thank you. Well, I think what I found interesting from your report was just how, in many ways, non-metro and metro areas have both seen an increase in jobs and a decrease in unemployment. But what really surprised me were two things. One, that it seems, even though the metro areas had an initial bigger economic shock from COVID, that the recovery rate for both areas or types of communities seems to be about the same. But I think it's really important for people to note, because as you noted, that recovery doesn't look the same in every place, in the sense, for some places it's a V, whoa, we had the crash and now we're recovering. But for a lot of places, it's actually a W. You have the crash and then a little recovery, and then and I think that's really important, especially for Vermont, as we go into, I think a lot of people are considering us going into a recovery phase right now. And yet there's a lot of people who are still in crisis mode, and are nowhere near recovery. And I just think that's something really important to keep coming back to remind us about recovery and what it needs and what it looks like. How about for you, Matt? What do you think is really crucial right now for rural economies post-COVID, or during COVID, I should say?
On a big picture level, I think there's two things. We are at risk with the pandemic of having a repeat of 2008. Right, the same kind of economic shock that facilitated more investment in automation is going to be here in spades in the pandemic, because not only do you have the issue of wanting to cut overall costs of labor and willingness to do long-term investments, especially with low interest rates, but you also you want to set up situations where you can avoid human contact altogether. And because of the pandemic. And so there's going to be a lot of continued pressure. You've seen it in places like, there was a story about the Land's End facility in rural Wisconsin that was investing, significantly in automating the already fairly high-tech processes that they had there. You even have, innovators in Vermont who are figuring out how to use robots to flip wheels of cheese. Because that's actually a pretty time-consuming and sometimes dangerous process that limits the height of the ceilings you can do stuff. And they're seeing a boost in that area. We need to understand that has implications, and ideally that we can get ahead of that, because it could lead to this kind of division happening again along geographic lines. The opportunity is that people are rethinking where tech jobs can take place. And that's true for larger tech companies who are suddenly abandoning their dogma that everyone has to be sitting in the same, set of city blocks or whatever it is, and having worked for one of those tech companies from White River Junction, Vermont, by the way. And I had colleagues who didn't realize 5 years into us working together that I wasn't living in California. This is a doable thing, but there is now a force function to open that aperture. And in some cases, companies saying that they're going to switch to that permanently. And that creates a real opportunity for looking at talent and the kind of creative contributions to the tech economy happening from anywhere. But then there are some other, challenges that are associated with this. We are seeing evidence that people are moving with their tech jobs, so specifically independent contractors who are in the technology profession, moving to rural places. In fact, we saw a 300% increase in the number of independent technologists saying that they were living in rural places versus urban between February and May. And we saw increases in employment in a lot of rural places, but you didn't see as dramatic a decrease in unemployment.
Yeah.
And while there is plenty of room to get back to equity on more people with high-paying jobs coming back to rural places or moving to rural places, we have a real risk of a division and greater stratification than we're already seeing in rural communities. And that's why we are putting a huge emphasis right now on deploying skilling programs for tech jobs for people who are economically displaced in rural places, so that they can also benefit from this opening of an aperture of where those kinds of tech jobs can come from. Now, there are lots of challenges with that, especially since tech companies are not used to onboarding new employees, particularly newly trained employees, without being in person. They're going to have to figure it out, right? If Zillow is gone all remote, they're going to need to figure out how to bring on new people without everyone sitting together. But
so can I jump in for a second? So before people would even need to onboard people, they would need to be interested in hiring people. And so we see this huge influx of folks who already have high-paying tech jobs who are moving here. And I have seen some evidence that hiring processes seem to have words that are much more open, don't have to be located here. But how folks in rural areas would have any way of actually accessing those jobs, whether it's because they have skills or not, but also whether or not they have the connections to be making those, and how the folks who are moving here with their financial privilege, their educational privilege, their lack of knowledge of the Vermont real estate market privilege, all of those things, those folks that are moving here, how can we really make the most of those new Vermonters to make sure that the folks who are already living here are gaining those connections to find those jobs?
Matt, before you answer that, I just need a little clarification from Emily, if you don't mind. So when you're talking about connections and the folks who are moving in, it sounds to me like you're not just talking about skills like can someone code. You're talking about kind of social capital and relationships, it sounds like.
Social capital, relationships, permission to seek something, knowing where to seek something, just being able to access the entire social and intellectual sector to seek those jobs, which is more than just the knowing someone who's in that position, but also even knowing how to navigate what a resume would look like for that sector, for instance.
And it sounds to me too, like if someone's a remote worker and they're moving to their home and they're staying in their home, they're not necessarily making connections to the local community. So there's that divide there.
And they likely don't even know that there's a local community to make connections to. We are, famously closed to outsiders. It's like, in some ways it's a secret language to even figure out when your garbage pickup is, right? Or like, there's no name for the street, but it's the street that used to be this other street where the Murrays lived or whatever. Yep. So a new person coming might not be accustomed to living somewhere where there is community and tradition and connections. And so to even know to go out and seek that would be a revelation.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, Matt. I needed all that in my head.
No. It's super helpful. And we need to recognize our shortcomings as a state in terms of assuming that everyone knows all the traditions and where the everything is, including the swimming holes in hot days of August and all of that. And so I think there's a couple of answers to your questions. One is that what what I think is true across the folks who are working at the Center on Rural Innovation is that we're all people who have deep roots in rural, but also recognize we've had the privilege of being able to work for national caliber organizations. And what I think gets us up every morning is to figure out how to make that bridge. Mm-hmm. How to make that bridge to, access to understanding how to look for jobs, how to be able to talk about your past experience in a way that is going to be recognizable by a recruiter at a company. I mean, one of the classic examples are people with military service who actually have incredible skill sets for technology jobs. It's just the way that they talk about it in their service record, it doesn't translate into the way that they talk about it in a Silicon Valley context. And so there is a lot, that's the work that we're doing every day. And I can't tell you that we have figured out all the solutions to it, but we're having the chance to really try various pieces. The other part on community is core to our work. It's a little more difficult in the pandemic, but it's not impossible. Because we do, actually, at the end of the day, we joke that the real core to rural economic development are the 3 Bs, which are broadband, blues, and beer.
I was scared you were going to say beer. Okay.
And if you can, I can't help myself.
I know
but it's there is the social dynamics are so important to create community, to create culture, including in a tech culture environment, and to be able to make sure that is inclusive from the get-go. Mm-hmm. And so there is a lot of the work that we're doing at the Black River Innovation Campus that is ensuring that people know that there is a way to connect to a community of other technologists, and that there is a way to be a part of a virtuous cycle. Whether it's on investment or mentorship, or being a part of a co-work space, which is bigger than just having a desk with a super fast internet connection. So that's very much a part of what we can do and what we need to do in order to be able to have this concept of building inclusive digital economy ecosystems be successful.
When speaking of beer, I'm curious if any of this work, if it's possible to not just shift the experience of people who are seeking work to give them, say, the code switching skills to be operating and permission to be operating in these other environments, but also to be working with larger technology companies and investors to actually have the cultural knowledge to be accessing rural folks on the terms of rural folks. So rather than at the risk of extreme stereotyping, I'm going to say, instead of asking rural folks to start enjoying IPAs, do you ever ask investors to start really drinking Budweiser?
So we do, and we own that need to be able to make that shift.
Why would companies want to make, that's the part I don't understand. Like, what incentive do those companies have to make that shift at all? Like, I feel like we're the sort of the beggars out here in rural America.
No, because there's still a desperate need for talent.
Okay.
Look, and I think on their best days, technology companies understand that they are creative enterprises. And if they are missing out on the creativity of let's say women, and have been lousy at actually recruiting and creating welcoming environments for women in their ranks of coders and software designers, they're missing out on half of the perspective of the country. Mm-hmm. Same with underrepresented minority communities that are out there and are consumers and need to be a part of that creative process. And I would say the same is true for geography. it was an eye-opening experience working at Google, particularly working with data center communities that were almost all rural. The assumptions that many folks who had never spent any time in rural were coming to those places with were completely off, including whether they could find talent there. And we were successful in convincing them to actually take a look at people who had non-traditional education backgrounds. And it turned out we found amazing, data techs and others in these rural places that could unpack a kernel faster than anyone else, even though their job history had been, as the assistant IT director at the local high school. So there is a large incentive for them to do this, especially once they get over the fact that, yes, you can do dynamic, collaborative, high bar work anywhere in the country. But Emily, as we're owning some of our own issues of bias in rural places, we've also found fascinating is that there are actually a lot of technology jobs locally, usually in non-technology companies like banks, universities, and others, and they don't hire locally. They actually go and hire, some hipster from Brooklyn at probably 3 times the cost they would have to, because they don't recognize that there are actually technologists here, whether they're technologists who are, working from their spare bedroom for a large San Francisco company, but would be much happier doing their, data science or coding or whatever for a local enterprise, or that could be coming out of one of our programs. And so we've been doing a lot of matchmaking in that direction, or helping grow awareness of what's actually available right here locally in terms of tech talent. We had a university we were working with in Kansas who was saying, we would be placing more of our computer science graduates locally if we only, if there was only demand. And we had to point out to them that they had 3 open positions that would be perfect for their graduates right there that they were recruiting for in Kansas City. So these are things that we need to overcome as we're trying to create that critical mass, whether it's from local companies that need that tech talent, it's people who are coming with their jobs remotely, and then cracking that code on how to bridge rural talent to folks who are hiring on a national or global level.
Thank you, Matt. We need to go to break, so we're going to hold it there, but stay with us. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and we are talking with Representative Emily Kornheiser and Matt Dunne from the Center on Rural Innovation. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for coming back. I want to go back to the study that your organization did, Matt, and talk about the concept of the urban exodus, because we've been hearing a lot about that. And it seems like, looking at your report, that yes, to a certain extent, this is happening. Just to bring it local for folks in Windham County, it looks like, according to the Center on Rural Innovation's data, Windham County, based on the number of second homes, could potentially see a population bump of 29%, which would be the highest in the state if this happened. So that brings me to the question, what does this mean for rural America if we have all these people coming from urban areas, bringing their jobs with them, but not necessarily being part of the local economy, in the sense that their job isn't part of the local economy?
Well, there are upsides to this, as well as there are going to be challenges. I mean, anytime you see a seismic shift like that, it's you've got to be ready for the impacts. We have for a while actually had struggles with the number of first homes that were being sold as second, third, or fourth homes. In fact, I mean, there were stories in Woodstock, which is right near where I am, where the green in the evening is pitch black, because no one's in the houses around the green, which used to be this center of vibrancy, but no one was ever there. And so that's not a good solution, right? Regardless of any of these other challenges that may come with it, having people who are actually, utilizing the homes and engaging and bringing their resources in to be able to contribute to the economy is a good thing. The question becomes how they do that. And the question also becomes how long they're going to be here. And we just don't know. There is certainly some evidence that people are moving up full time. I believe it was the Dover School District that has already seen a 25% increase in their student count. Which is someone who has been, concerned over the declining student populations in rural Vermont for a long time. That's great news on a variety of levels. But that's not going to happen uniformly, and we have to really see whether or not, how this all settles out. We definitely know that people moved up to their second homes. Many people bought houses, sometimes sight unseen, driving up the demand and the cost of these houses, only to your point earlier. But it's but we don't know if it will return back to some lower level later. And then the question is, how do you welcome the folks who are coming with their jobs in a way that they can be productive members of the community? Because again, that's how Vermont has been able to succeed as well as it has over the years, even though we haven't had, huge, concentrations of wealth. We have actually been careful about boom bust cycles, types of development and that kind of thing. It's been that sense of community and making sure that folks are actually a part of the whole that they're in. That's harder than social distancing, but we can. But it's going to be the test of whether or not this is successful for Vermont.
The Vermonters that I know tend to interact with tourists in a very different, welcoming way than they interact with new community members. And I think in both cases, they're very welcoming. It's just a very different kind of welcoming. And so I think a lot is going to depend on whether folks who are sort of converting their second homes into primary homes, if they're interested in sort of staying in a tourist lifestyle full time and just happening to work. In terms of what that will mean for both the types of investments they'll make in our economy, whether it's just going to be sort of, tchotchke stores, restaurants, and those are all revenue, and revenue is great. And certainly Brattleboro's economy is quite dependent on its tchotchke stores and restaurants. But that switch into investing in the school systems, we're seeing that school districts that tend to be entirely sending towns, or school districts that are completely school choice are having much higher bumps than school districts with less choice. So people are picking their second home options in very specific ways that are going to have significantly different strains. Or we have communities like Dover that if every second home converts to a primary home, the entire demographics of that area are going to be upended completely, right? And so what story will we tell about that politically? The transition from, the hippie migration, I guess we could call it, it took more than a decade for, it probably took an entire generation for that generation of folks who came here to really become Vermonters and for people to really appreciate their contributions to the community and for them to start making contributions economically to the community.
Well, and also to realize that standing up and speaking 7 times at your first town meeting might not go over well, right? And I have deep roots that go back many generations in the Northeast Kingdom, but my father didn't grow up in Vermont, and when they came up, there was a transition process that they had to make, as well as the community, and understanding what the importance of how they could contribute without necessarily compromising or damaging the values that they had. So I think it's going to be very interesting how these work through. And you know, you have when people make it through their first mud season, that's not in a pandemic, is always an enlightening moment, and such things. But you know, I'm hopeful. I believe that we are in a place where there's been a lot of there's you know been a lot of exodus of particularly younger families and younger people, and the potential for that changing, I think, is great. And I also think that there are some other things that on a policy basis could help you know, direct this in a different direction.
And I'm really curious about that, particularly because I'm getting a little caught up in the cultural challenges, because it feels like we're deep in the thick of that right now. But so much of our investments as a legislature have been in sort of propping up what was, instead of thinking about what needs to be or what will be.
Sure.
And so really curious to hear from you what policy shifts and what investments might be needed to really think about what a post-COVID or mid-COVID economy could look like.
Yeah. So let me give you just a couple of thoughts, and I've shared this with folks from the legislature who have asked over the last year. One is obviously broadband. I mean, I think that one of the other big indicators that any realtor will tell you when they're hearing from folks about, oh, I need to buy a house in Vermont and get out of New York City is, will I be able to connect to the internet? And fortunately, there have been innovative, you know, small telephone companies like Waitsfield and VTEL, as well as innovative social enterprises like EC Fiber, that have been out there showing models for delivering world-class broadband to communities. We're not there yet, but there's been some excellent progress, and frankly, the legislature has stepped up with resources to make sure that those kinds of pre-development grants can happen to allow for that planning to move forward and to move to actually building that infrastructure at an accelerated rate. The second is around housing, which you know is definitely it was a concern before, and is going to continue to accelerate as more people realize the amazing place that we have in Vermont, and decide that they want to be a part of it for the shorter or long term. And I think that there is, you know, certainly an ongoing commitment to bonding for dollars to accelerate that housing investment that we've actually seen in the last couple of years. I also think there's ways to diversify the kinds of housing that the state is investing in. We absolutely need to have investment in permanently affordable housing. Must happen. We've got to get there. But there are also ways that the state could incentivize market rate downtown housing. That could allow for a variety of different kinds of investor types to come in to put real resources into livable, walkable communities in our smaller downtowns, and give options for folks. So it's not either, you know, permanently affordable, or you've got to be able to pay, you know, $600,000 for a house, right? There's lots of room in between.
And we've talked about the missing middle quite a bit, and had Laura Collins on the show, I think more than once, to talk about this stuff. Yeah.
And so there's lots of room for that, especially in some of the communities that have been hit hard by the economic transitions. There's just not a lot of inventory for folks who are early professionals who may be, you know, in a tech job that's local or remote or whatever else, or from here, to be able to have that place that they would want to live. And there's lots of buildings and capacity for it if we focus on it. And then the other piece is trying to figure out how to provide some level of incentive for people to move to places that have capacity for that kind of growth and for absorbing more folks, which is just not going to be the same across the board. And so we actually proposed a program that would allow for someone to have a reduction in their student loans if they purchase a home in a non-urban new market tax credit census tract. Right? New market tax credit census tracts are not perfect, but they're an interesting national demarcation of places that are struggling economically. And if we did that, I think we could, kill two birds with one stone. One is really address the higher education debt crisis that we're facing as a country, and encourage particularly younger professionals to locate into our St. Johnsbury's, our Springfields, our Newports, our Benningtons.
I mean, it's basically everything except for sort of the Chittenden County, Montpelier Beltway, and the Upper Valley that we're talking about when we talk about that, just for our listeners who might not have all of their demographics in mind.
Yep. But it also includes some, rural places that, it includes Randolph. It includes some very rural areas that are struggling economically. I think most of the Northeast Kingdom would be included in that grouping. But it would provide a nudge that would be predicated on real investment. So not just some fly by night. Someone actually saying, we're going to buy a place. We're going to be here for some period of time, and we're going to put down some roots.
So, go ahead, Elka.
Oh, I was just going to ask, one thing Emily and I talk a lot about on the Montpelier Happy Hour are wages, and how wages in Vermont really need a helping hand up. So I understand that a lot of tech jobs pay well. But how can we use this opportunity around tech jobs to kind of start raising wages in general? And how do we make sure that a company outside Vermont or any rural community isn't just looking at the rural community as an easy way to pay lower wages? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to push back on it a little bit in that last statement, because I think there is a perfectly good market force that says that it is insane to be only paying people who have to live in a location where they're spending $4,500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment, right? That, the difference in cost of living right now between urban and rural places is so insane that I think we have a moment where we can say perfectly reasonably that a tech employer can actually source superb talent in a place where they can pay them less and still have that person have an equivalent experience of living as someone who's trying to, live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Brooklyn, or the Haight. So, there is a, I think there's plenty of room to say, you know what, we can actually provide you. I worked for a tech company that was based in Wilder, Vermont during the 90s, and it was founded by two Dartmouth grads that were solving a market problem in the commercial printing industry. We grew it to 120 employees, and the founder at one point said, you know why we're successful? It's because we get geeks cheap, right? And they live incredibly well where they are. He also said there's a reason why we give such great maternity and paternity leave, because as soon as they have kids, they know this is where they want to be for the rest of their life. And so we have great employee retention. And I think that's fine. And I don't think it is in that sense, predatory, because we're talking about people who are still going to be making well above the living wage. The harder question is about how do you make that translate into other kinds of jobs? Now, I'm actually a strong believer in a $15 minimum wage. I also think the best thing you can do to actually support entrepreneurship is to have universal health care, right? And it's always fascinating to me when I talk to sometimes reporters or political types who are like, wait, how can you be pro-business and pro-single-payer healthcare? I said, you know what?
Takes a huge cost off of businesses.
Of course. And you should actually talk to folks who are in Silicon Valley, who are actually some of the biggest advocates for moving to universal single payer health care, because they know what it's like. If you're actually going to give opportunities for people to start companies, to be able to innovate, to be able to you got to deal with their student debt, and you've got to deal with the existential threat of a healthcare crisis taking them down. So, all of that aside, the fact that there is going to be higher wages in the communities, hopefully not dependent on one company, because we also get in trouble when we do that, that are able to have a diversified base and are being able to benefit from the automation that is coming. And I have many friends who say, oh, shouldn't we just stop, automation from taking place? And I guess my response is good luck, right? But we have plenty of innovative people that can actually embrace the jobs that are going to be the drivers of that innovation, just like rural folks did in the past. I mean, the technology that went into the first washing machines came from farmers who were trying to do other things with crops, right? And they were just noodling around. They said, this kind of works. And folks at the Extension Service, we were able to help connect them to ways to patent that technology. And then you had the Maytags of the world. We have to get back to that kind of an understanding that entrepreneurship can happen anywhere in the country. We just have to make that accessible. And then we need to make sure that we're doing things to lift all boats across the board.
And so again, that's not necessarily an understanding that we need to get to. We need to really build the infrastructure to make that possible.
Amen.
Yeah.
So we have just about 5 minutes left, but I know Emily wanted to touch base on innovation hubs. So what questions did you have for Matt?
Thanks. So I think we have, one of the themes here is sort of the story we tell about our own communities, right? And I think one of the dangers that you mentioned with a huge number of folks moving here with jobs from outside is that we're going to sort of further the divide in our communities. And part of that, I think, is that we have a lot of people who might have a story of Vermont that's thriving because they're not aware of what's happening to their neighbors. And it's one of the things that's interesting about Vermont, the way our sort of housing is very mixed on each road, and I appreciate that. So when I think about the work that I did in innovation hubs back when I was traveling internationally and consulting on that, so much of that work and the original impetus around these innovation hubs was in countries that were really making a very large leap from one type of economy to another. We're very much an emerging market where folks had not, accessed smartphone technology before, where folks often hadn't accessed computers before. We were moving from sort of no phone, no copper lines to full cloud service. And so because we were making that leap, there was so much potential for growth. And so it was very easy to both excite people who had never had access to that kind of connectivity before, to have much larger markets for international companies to invest in. And so when I think of doing that in the context of rural communities that consider themselves developed economies, that were, are part of what is hypothetically one of the greatest economies on earth, how do you translate that in the absence of sort of all of the gaping hope and potential that folks in emerging markets see?
Yeah, so it's hard, and it's hard for a couple of different reasons. One is the narrative that has started to get baked in, which is that the reason that rural places have not been able to succeed in building technology jobs is because that's not what they do. Right? That somehow something is baked into rural people's DNAs that they can't do coding or technology work. And it is, and it's prevalent both, in big cities who don't understand rural people, but it's also sometimes prevalent within rural communities and rural organizations. And, I have to say that there are sometimes when I go to, rural economic development summits, and I talk about the ability to build digital economy ecosystems, they say, oh, well, you're not talking about rural then. I'm like, what are you talking about, right? And I haven't said that we got to have people coming out of MIT, or that you got to have people who are, working for big tech company here or there or whatever. I'm just saying technology jobs and innovation. So, and because it seems like it should be something that should be available, it then gets baked into this sense of, oh, there just must be something wrong with them. And so we're doing a lot more narrative shifting than I would have thought was going to be necessary. I've actually had people who have said to me, maybe you should take the word rural out of the name of your organization because it has such negative connotations. And I mean, Emily, you may have been ready for that. I wasn't, right? I was like, what are you talking about? It's an asset. It's great. It's excellent. But we've got a lot of work to do, both, within, our own communities and organizations, as well as externally, to overcome that. Because I think, and I think it's because there is this notion that maybe the world isn't flat, but the U.S. sure is, right? Except it's not. And it's and while I deeply believe there, in the age of the internet, there should be no limit to where digital economy jobs and entrepreneurship should be able to take place. We've got to be able to get to the place where we have proof of concept. We can tell that story, and we can tell it in a variety of different angles. I mean, it's the same is true. There is a belief that when you're talking about rural America, you're talking about white America.
Yes. Not true at all.
Not true at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, if we're focused on equity and inclusion, if you are Black or brown and in rural America, your challenges to be able to succeed are even higher than most folks who are in similar demographics in urban places. So we've got some important, great work to do, but we need to overcome those, stereotypes, including stereotypes about ourselves and our community's capacities, as well as those external. And we think we're making progress. We got a lot of work to do, but that's become, I think, the biggest barrier to the success, along with making sure that we're, actually having broadband, which is the electricity of our time, which we have not quite solved yet. But even in those places where we have solved it, and lots of rural folks who just use creative, innovative ways to get it done, it's still not having the immediate economic benefit that you might hope for.
Thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately, but Matt Dunne from the Center on Rural Innovation, it was such a pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Emily, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
You can find me on emilykornheiser.org or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, only Emily Kornheiser in the whole world. And restarting weekly community forums via Zoom, 10 a.m. every Saturday. You can find the link to join me on Front Porch Forum on the website or on any of those socials I listed. Look forward to many more conversations.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour can be found on WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 every Friday at 2 p.m. and as well as our Vermontitude Facebook page and our Vermontitude SoundCloud page. Have a great weekend.
How do we find you?
Yes, Matt.
Yes.
Read this study if anyone really wants to read the study.
Right. If our website is ruralinnovation.us. And you can find the study there under our recent publications, as well as other information on the work we're doing. Sign up for our newsletter, which is a monthly content-rich newsletter on the work that we're doing and that we're seeing, and some of those narrative shifts. So encourage people to visit the site and get involved.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.